This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is The Third Man, the classic film from the 1940s. We'll be talking with two experts on why it is a great film, and the conversation will start in a moment. The subject is The Third Man, the classic noir thriller, and I am speaking with two men who are experts on it. On the left of the screen is Peter Evans. He is a film professor. And on the right is Charles Drazen, who's written many articles and books about British cinema. So as I usually like to do, I want to give both men a chance to introduce themselves and their interest in the film. So let me start with you, Peter. Can you give it a little bit of précis of who you are and your take on the movie?
Well, my name is Peter Evans. I used to be a professor of film at Queen Mary at the University of London, and I've published on various topics related to film, especially Hollywood. I've written on, in collaboration with Bruce Babington, books on the Hollywood musical, romantic comedy, and the biblical epic. And then I wrote a couple of BFI classics, one on Britain on the Wind, and another one on the Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. And that is related to my interest in Spanish cinema, above all Buñuel. I published on Buñuel. But beyond that, I've also written on British cinema and a book on Carol Reed. I retired from the university teaching a few years ago.
And just sort of as an opening salvo, I would assume since you're appearing on the show, you think that the film is a great film. We'll get it a little more in depth, but is there one or two points that you think are great about the film that is often overlooked?
Well, I think it's a film that's been so well appreciated and so well covered in writing, both in journalism and in academic scholarship. I think there's very little that's been overlooked. However, I think there's still a lot to be said about some of the minor characters. Bernard Lee, for example, playing Sergeant Payne, and the wonderful Wilfrid White as the British Council representative Craven. So I think we can talk about their contribution, especially their contribution towards not only the suspense of the film, but also, I think, the comedy of the film. I think that's something that people have pointed out in the past, but perhaps without too much emphasis, and maybe that's something we can talk about as well. That the comic strain of The Third Man.
Okay. On the right is Charles Drazen. As I asked of Peter, can you give a little background about yourself and one or two things maybe about the film that you think makes it great that maybe you think has been overlooked?
Sure, yes. So I started out in my working life in publishing, actually. And I was a kind of writer monkey, editing other people's books, wanting to write my own. And I had a sense then, so this is back in the early 90s, and the British cinema then was not very highly regarded. And I felt very strongly that actually there were some great qualities that the British cinema had. And my first book really was an effort to bring out some of those qualities, and it focused on the 1940s cinema. And it's impossible to write about the 1940s British cinema without writing about Carol Reed, who clearly stood out at that time. And of the films he made in the 1940s, The Third Man, I mean, we're talking about it today as a great film. Why is it a great film? I guess one reason for me is, often films do date. I don't think that's true of The Third Man. I think Some Sign of Greatness is a film that actually you can return to 50 years on, 70 years on, more than 70 years on now. And in some way it still in some way remains relevant. And I'm very struck actually watching it now, knowing that we were going to do this interview. I had a look at it a couple of days ago, and I was very struck by how it speaks to our time today. It still has that ability to connect with the particular time that people sit down to watch it. So I think that's one aspect of the film I would single out.
Well, let's, before we hit the film, give a little background about the film. And obviously, the first thing to do in that regard is to talk about Graham Greene, the writer of the novella the film is based on, as well as the screenplay, a little bit about him, and also the genesis of the novella. So I don't know if either one of you want to take the lead on that. Who was Graham Greene, and why did he write this novella?
Well,
Peter, shall I?
Yeah, go on, Charles. You go.
Yeah, well, Graham Greene in the 1940s had a reputation as being a leading British novelist, and he talked about his serious work and his less serious work, and had a sense of, famously, there were novels he called entertainments, and then there were the serious novels, which he distinguished from the entertainments. And I think he regarded his work as a screenwriter as being very much belonging to that entertainment department. But I think very strikingly, he was a writer, a novelist who, unlike many people from that time, did not look down on the cinema, and he gathered quite a considerable reputation as a film writer, as a film critic in the 1930s, before he went into writing his own screenplays. So I think he brought to his work as a screenwriter, as opposed to a novelist, a great sense of the craft of writing for the cinema, which was unusual for that time. And in answer to your question, how did the novella come into being? He was asked to write a treatment for a film to be set in Vienna by the producer Alexander Korda. So rather than write a treatment, he actually wrote a long story, and that was effectively the treatment for the script that he then went on to write with the director Carol Reed.
So this was a similar process then to, say, 2001 with Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick, that they were sort of, it wasn't already written and then developed into a film. They went hand in hand.
It was always meant to be a film from the very outset.
Yeah.
So that was the reason for the novella. And then the step from the story to the screenplay was Carol Reed and Graham Greene sitting down together to write a script.
Peter, do you have any comments on the writing of the novella?
No, I just add one thing to what Charles has been saying, which is that absolutely correctly that Greene was very interested in the cinema and wrote some fascinating film journalism. There's a famous piece that he wrote where he talks about Shirley Temple, for example, and that led to a court case where he begins to explore the, I suppose, the not to mince words, the paedophilic aspects of the use of Shirley Temple in some of those films. But from the point of view of the relevance for The Third Man, I think that it's worth saying that he was very much impressed by the films that Carol Reed had made back in the 30s, starting with Midshipman Easy, but a couple of other films that he made. And he admired not only the content of these films, but above all the style of the films. So he was already very much well disposed to Carol Reed before he began to work with him. And of course, he then made 3 films with him: The Fallen Idol, The Third Man, and Our Man in Havana. And just as a kind of postscript to this, it's revealing how much he not only admired Carol Reed, but at the same time thought less well of Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, Hitchcock wanted to make a film of Our Man in Havana, Green really wasn't very keen on this and would preferred, and this is what happened in the end, for Reed to make it. Why he was so dismissive of Hitchcock is a mystery, frankly. But anyway, he was, and the relationship between Green and Reed flourished in all three films.
Well,
I think this is a very important point, actually, the fact that you have a writer and a director who really hit it off. They're a really good creative team. And if you want to understand, I mean, that's one reason why The Third Man turned out as wonderful a film as it did, because you had two creative partners who are in tune.
Yeah. Could it be regarding the thing with Hitchcock and Green's not wanting to work with him? I mean, I think Hitchcock myself was a good director of what I would call popcorn thrillers, but I've never seen the psychological real depth that, say, a film like Third Man would have, or even some of the films by, and I was going to mention this, films like by David Lean or The Archers either. And I'm wondering if Green probably thought that it would be too fluffy, if you will, under Hitchcock.
I think Green and Carol Reed were realists. They had a sense of realism,
yeah,
which I think is very un-Hitchcockian.
Yeah,
and that.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that eye for the face, the perfect face, capturing a slice of life is something I associate with Reed, and I don't really find in Hitchcock.
Mm.
Yes, that's right.
Peter, yes.
No. All I was going to say was I'm agreeing with both of you that there is a blend, isn't there, of the tradition of social realism, if you like, or documentary realism that is such a prominent feature of a certain tendency in the British cinema, and on the other hand, the influences of other less socially realistic directors that you find. I mean, for example, I suppose we'll get around to talking about the expressionism, if you like, the traces of expressionism in The Third Man. So those are welded with the realism that you and Charles have been mentioning.
Yeah, I know. I saw a BBC documentary from the early or mid '60s on Green, and one of the things when they got to talking about The Man from Havana, this was just a few years before the first James Bond film came out, and I remember Green, meaning Green, was quite sort of dismissive of Ian Fleming. He thought, I think, very much in the same way that maybe Fleming and Hitchcock might have made a great team together, but he wanted to be taken seriously as a writer, even if he was doing a political thriller.
Well, I think there's a roundness of character apart from the story, which I think is very typical of Carol Reed and not Hitchcockian, which is all about story.
Yeah. So
telling story and suspense and all these ingredients we associate with Hitchcock is something I think Carol Reed and Graham Greene did not take very seriously. They wanted to create a real world. I mean, story was very important, but paying respect to the quirks of character was also important.
So before we get to the film itself, I did want to mention, though, and put Carol Reed within the context of other filmmakers in Britain at the time. Now, much has been made about Italian neorealism, and then there was, of course, the new cinema of the 1960s, both in Hollywood and in Europe, sweeping around the world, the new wave, Nouvelle Vague. But were people like Hitchcock and Reed, the Archers, and Lean, were they all considered sort of a generation, the first generation of, say, post-silent English directors? Was there any kind of rivalry between any of them?
Well, I think in the 1940s, certainly Carol Reed and David Lean had by that time very much come to the fore, and they were often talked of in the same breath. And so I guess there was a kind of rivalry there, for sure.
And of course, Hitchcock had, by that time, decamped to Hollywood, hadn't he? So he wasn't sort of part of the scene any longer.
So you said, just to get...
I don't see that there's... I mean, there would...
You're just fading in and out there. Sorry.
Right.
Peter.
No, I think there's a natural rivalry, isn't there, between creative artists, whether we're talking about film directors or writers or painters. But I don't think there was any overt hostility expressed publicly. There was...
Okay, so you'd mentioned The Fallen Idol, and I know here in America, I think The Fallen Idol is one of sort of like a 3-pack of films released by a company here called the Criterion Collection. I think it was Odd Man Out, Fallen Idol, and The Third Man. And Fallen Idol, by some people, is sort of considered as a precursor. Now, you mentioned that Green had written that. Were there any connections literarily or between the films? I mean, stylistically, you have the canted angles that Reed imposed, but was there any connection with Green's work between the two films?
Well, I think thematically they're very close. So Fallen Idol is about a little boy who fails to understand what's going on between the adults, and The Third Man is about a rather innocent American who comes into a very complex war-torn Europe and doesn't really understand what's going on in this rather corrupt world he finds himself in. So definitely very strong thematic links between the two films.
All right. Go ahead, Peter.
I think that Reed is always very interested in children, and maybe we'll talk about that, the role of the little boy in The Third Man. Far less important and prominent than the little, nevertheless, a character who contributes towards the sort of larger thematics of the film as well.
So let's talk about The Third Man itself. Let's talk about a little bit about the production issues, and then we'll talk about the actual film, the story, and all the other things associated with it. So famously, the film, was produced, and I think the then putative star, I guess you'd call him, even though he doesn't have the most screen time, Orson Welles was late to the production, and he missed some scenes, etc. Was Orson Welles always supposed to be Harry Lime, or was he a last-minute replacement? And was did Reed? Because it seems to me when I actually watched the film, there's a great deal of introspection into the Joseph Cotton character. So was he considered the lead of the film, and Orson Welles what we would now call a special guest star in the last third of the film, or what things plagued the production, if any?
Well, when they were in pre-production, they talked of the two lead stars, the villain and the hero, and various names were mentioned as for both of those roles. So at one point, Noel Coward was considered as a possibility for Harry Lime. David Niven was mentioned. But from fairly early on, Carol Reed was very keen that Welles should play Harry Lime, much to the reluctance initially of David Selznick, because Welles by that time did not have a very strong box office reputation, and he just appeared in Macbeth had just come out and performed very badly at the box office. So that was a big concern to David Selznick, that Welles just was not good box office.
Peter?
I think that, as Charles says, various people were considered, and I think until quite late on, Cary Grant was going to be in the frame for the Holly Martins character, and I think people had thought of Noel Coward in the Harry Lime role, and that really didn't get off the ground. But I think Cary Grant was quite a serious possibility, and then for one reason or other, he was dithering about the fee that he would get for the role, and eventually everyone tired of waiting for him and went ahead without him. So I think that really almost happened. The other thing to say is that for some reason or other, Carol Reed appears not to have been hugely impressed by Joseph Cotton, and eventually gave way. And of course, Joseph Cotton, like Alida Valli, were two contract players for Selznick, who was keen to have in the film. So eventually Selznick got his way, and Cotton was cast as Holly Barton.
Now, Alida Valli was billed, I believe, in the film just as Valley. Was she the ingenue of Selznick's world there, or was she a big star beforehand?
No, she'd
been in Italian. So she'd been in Italian pictures, and Selznick had brought her over from Italy. So she was very early on in her Hollywood career when she appeared in The Third Man, yeah. And she was a star that Selznick was very much hoping to build.
And the funny thing is, although she was Italian, and as Charles says, appeared in Italian films. Actually, she had Viennese, Austrian ancestry, as it happened, and rather appropriate for her role as Anna in the film.
So before we just get into the film, there is one more player that we should talk about beforehand, and that's Anton Karas and his famous theme song, which is, even today, decades later, you just hear that instantly. You think of The Third Man. So maybe, Charles, if you want to just talk a little bit about who Karas was and how he got involved in the film, and was that already a musical piece that he had written, or was it written specifically for the film?
Well, I think, interestingly, the original plan was to have a traditional score, and it was only when the crew went out to Vienna, they shot on location in Vienna, that they heard this strange instrument that was being played in Vienna, the zither. And Anton Karas was not a particularly well-known zither player who would turn up at weddings and various events playing his zither. And I think he had turned up at some party that the crew attended when they were in Vienna making the film. And Reed was just struck by this extraordinary music, which captured so much the location and atmosphere of Vienna. So he thought, well, we've got to get the zither in some way. But the plan was still to have a conventional score. It was only by degrees that Reed felt, well, actually, why not have the zither run through the entire film? And he brought Karas to London after the film had been shot, and they sat down. And I don't think I'm not sure that Karas could even read music, and the tunes were very much improvised. And he sat down. I think this is an interesting aspect of the film, actually, that the way he sat down with Carol Reed and composed the score to the film, and it gives the score in a way that it's not a traditional score. It's Anton Karas responding to what he's seeing, and with Carol Reed at his elbow, nudging him to get the right atmosphere. And I think it gives the zither music a kind of chorus-like quality, the way it comments on the action. You use the word, I think, character, Dan. I think that's right. It is like another character, someone commenting on what's happening in the film.
You know what? It reminds me of later. If you 20 years later, when Kurt Vonnegut wrote his book Slaughterhouse-Five, he uses the refrain of Poota Wheat of a bird, and to me the zither music is like Vonnegut's Poota Wheat.
Yeah, it's interesting. It has its own sensibility somehow. It's responding to the action and making its comment on the action, which is very unusual.
Absolutely. It's a bit like, I suppose it's comparable to the Wagnerian leitmotif, isn't it? That you, when you hear certain strains, you identify those strains with certain moods that the film is trying to create. So there are different cadences, different phrases of the music that, as Charles says, punctuate the film. The other interesting thing is when it's not used. I mean, I'm thinking right at the very end of the film when Harry Lime is in the sewer trying to escape from Calloway and the police and the army. The music has disappeared, and instead of which you have the sound of the wind to add menace to the sequence rather wonderfully. The music is gone. Why is the music gone? Because Harry Lime is about to end his life, and so the Harry Lime music is fading away, has been lost now on the soundtrack, instead of which we now have the rather menacing wind instead.
So the film opens up and we see scenes of the war, and we get the narration in the UK version by Reed himself. In the US version, we get Joseph Cotten, and they are slightly different. Was that because Selznick or the American companies that were distributing, did they not like the Reed narration? Did they ask for it to be redone, or did Reed think that it needed to be done differently in both countries?
Well, I think that...
Peter, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that there are various authors, critics, like Charles, Rob White, and others have pointed out already. I think that what vexed Selznick, I'm writing this to Charles, aren't I? That what vexed Selznick was the idea that Martins would turn out to be a rather futile character, not the heroic type that American audiences, in Selznick's view, were accustomed to, and therefore he had to beef up the Americanness of the Martins character, and so that it becomes Martins' story. And as regards the prologue, rather than having a kind of disembodied narrator, who, by the way, identifies himself with the racketeering, because he uses the word "we" in talking in Vienna. So instead of having the disembodied narrator, you have Martins, who becomes the overall sort of controller of the narrative. And elsewhere in the film, his futility is toned down, and the more heroic aspects built up.
You know, it's interesting.
Yes, I think.
Go ahead. I'll comment when you.
Yes, I think in the preferred Carol Reed version, Martins is a very ineffectual character. He's out of his depth. He achieves very little, and I think something that really annoyed Selznick, and he felt that was quite unacceptable, and that was driving him to give Martins more agency, and that accounted for the changes he made to the American release.
You know, just thinking about it, it didn't occur to me until Peter had mentioned it. Because the Reed voiceover, we never meet that putative character within the film ever. But by making it Martins, and then, you know, having the famous shot at the end where, you know, Alida Valley walks by him and it's sort of like, you know, drop dead bastard, you know, by making Martins the narrator from the beginning, it sets up the expectation that he is the hero, that he is going to have the classic, that he's going to get the girl at the end. And again, this just came to me. It's almost a great anticlimax that he doesn't. And I think in that sense, it's more effective to use the Martins character, even if the narration may not be as prototypically well written, but emotionally, it kind of adds a little something, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think what the difference is that in the British version, where, as you say, it's Carol Reed himself who is whose voice is being used for the narration at the beginning. The emphasis is on the conceptual. It takes the film away from the more conventional narrative that involves a heroic figure.
Yeah.
And by giving it to Joseph Cotton as Martins, that process is reversed. It becomes less conceptual and much more generic.
Yeah.
The genre of the hero who is in control. But very interestingly, I think, Charles, you point this out in your book. It was although Graham Greene acknowledges or refers to the fact that it was Carol Reed's suggestion, unlike what happens in the novella, that the ending should be one where Alida Valli walks away from Martins. So Greene kind of pays homage to Reed for that idea. But actually, I'm right in thinking, aren't I, Charles, that it was Selznick himself who came up with that idea first of all.
Yes, absolutely. Selznick felt that the idea of Valli going off with the person who just killed the person she was so deeply in love with was something that audiences just wouldn't accept. I think quite rightly.
Yeah. So Holly Martins himself is sort of a low-grade pulp writer. He writes sort of second-rate Zane Grey Western novels. He's certainly not the classic hero. He's coming to Vienna because his pal Harry Lime, who he knew some years back before the war, I believe, has offered him some kind of a job. And he gets there, and bam, he finds out that Lime is supposedly dead. And then we get the unraveling of the legend of Harry Lime for a good portion of the film, maybe 40 or 50% of the film. So let me just ask both of you then. Let's explain what the title is for those who don't know. Who is the third man? Because the third man within the narrative is really just, in a sense, a MacGuffin, to use Hitchcockian language. Peter,
I always find this terribly difficult to explain who the third man is. Peter, why don't you have a go?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that it's the porter who refers to the fact that there was a third man,
yeah.
Isn't it? And I think that comment at some point, somebody says it could have been anybody. And I think that idea that it could have been anybody refers to the way in which the film wants to share out all the guilt, so that, if you like, the Manichaean worldview that Martins starts up with, there are good and there are bad, as there are in his Zane Grey-esque novels, The Oklahoma Kid and so forth, is something that he comes to learn is a rather simplistic way of looking at life. There's a wonderful moment in Odd Man Out where where the policeman says to the artist in that film, "There's no such thing as good and bad, only innocence and guilt." And I think that that's something which you might apply. One might apply to the third man as well. That we're all of us we're all of us complicit in the kinds of activities we may be villainous at one extreme of the spectrum or the other, but there's no way that any of us can shirk our involvement in the sort of complexities of human behavior. We are all of us guilty of one sort of misdemeanor or another. So that Manichaean good versus bad worldview that Martins has is related, I think, to the point that the porter is making. It could have been anybody. the third man.
Yeah.
Where
I
all
think,
of us.
I mean, it's very interesting that it's Harry Lime, of course, who makes the point that there are no heroes.
Yeah.
And this is an idea that I think the film plays with. Holly Martins has this very black and white view of the world, that there are sheriffs and bad guys, and what he finds in Vienna undermines that way of looking at the world.
Well, now let me throw something out to two of you and see what you think of it. Obviously, as we just mentioned, there's an in-world, in-universe idea of the third man. We don't necessarily know who it could be. But in my mind, the third man obviously becomes at the end when Alida Valli is walking away from Holly Martins. There's Martins, there's the real Harry Lime, and then there's her version of Harry Lime, who's still a hero. And by walking away from Martins, she's choosing to live in this fantasy world where Harry was not the man everyone now knows him to be. Does that have any truck with you, that the third man is the fantasy version of Lime that Valli or Anna has built up?
I don't think she sees him as a hero.
No.
By the end of the film. But he is someone that she was in love with, and she is going to be true to him to the very end. I think that it underlies the way the film ends. I think the theme of loyalty is something that runs very powerfully through the film.
I think that's right. I think there's an unshakable devotion that she has for Harry, and she takes him as he is, warts and all, so to speak. She doesn't want him to be transformed into either a villain or a hero or whatever. He is as he is, and of course she's attracted to so many different aspects of him, including the fact that he has retained that sort of boyishness. She says the world grew up around him. There's a kind of cheeky rebelliousness about Harry Lime to which he's attracted. Never mind some of the seamier sides to his personality, including the fact that he has betrayed her.
Let's talk a little bit then about Holly Martins. He arrives and he becomes an accidental thorn in the side in this ongoing investigation in Vienna, which is partitioned by the four major powers. Harry Lime, it turns out, is a black market drug dealer. And yet, it seems to me that part of the kind of low-grade B novelist self that's within Martins, it's his suspicions that drive the film. As he's got this suspicious nature, and he keeps getting in trouble. And every time he goes this way or goes that way, he meets a neighbor. He gets in the way of the local police. He gets in the way of the military, and he starts sort of putting together this stuff after having gone to the putative Lime's funeral. And I think that's an interesting way, is that he's again sort of the accidental hero, although he's not really a hero, but he's the accidental lead in that he's not really looking for any of this. All he did was come across looking for some work to buoy himself, and all of a sudden he's thrust in the middle of this, cloak and dagger situation. Peter, what is your take on the Martins character and how he sort of accidentally propels the film for a while?
Well, yes, I suppose there are a couple of things at the very least to say. First of all, I think the film and the novella, I suppose, belong to that tradition of what you might call the transatlantic theme. So many American writers, Scott Fitzgerald and others, have touched on the American innocent abroad in a corrupt Europe. When one thinks of Portrait of a Lady and so on. So there's that element of the innocent, the ingenue American surrounded by corrupt Europeans. And There's a wonderful moment in Hitchcock's Foreign Correspondent, which has a moment where Joel McCrea turns up in Europe and is dressed very soberly and very formally, and he has a hat, a bowler hat, and it's only when he's out in the countryside and the wind knocks off his hat as he sees the windmill where the villains are, which the villains are using. So when the wind blows off his hat, in other words, where he has become less stuffy, less European, that he begins to see reality as it truly is. And there's something of that in The Third Man as well. Eventually, the sort of the true Americanness, if you like, the heroic Americanness of the Holly Martin's character is allowed to come through once he has been exposed to the corruption of the European. So that's one theme which I think the film is interested in exploring. But the other thing is that, of course, and Selznick himself was rather worried by it, is what you might call the homosocial attraction of Martin's for Harry Lime. Now, clearly, this is not something that's overtly expressed, but it was sufficient for Selznick to worry about the fact that this might be regarded not just a homosocial, but a homosexual friendship between the two men. And I think that if we start to talk about friendship and how the friendship theme is developed in the film, I think we need to consider some of these aspects as well.
I mean, I think a key, we mentioned already this theme of loyalty. This is something that both Holly and Anna share in common. It's what brings them together, their shared devotion to Harry. And it's that devotion which really triggers the story, isn't it? It's Holly's determination to prove that the police are wrong and to stand up for a friend. I think that's a very attractive aspect of Holly's character, although in many ways he's portrayed as being out of his depth. Yeah. I think finally we come to regard Holly as being a hero in terms of standing that really matter. Although he is an unconventional hero, always somehow with quotes around that word here, I think by the end of the film, we feel that at the decisive moments, he stood up for things that are really important, and that's what makes him come through, finally, as a kind of hero by the end of the film. But the whole thing's motivated initially by friendship and his wish to be a good friend. And of course, that has a huge irony when we think how his last act of friendship is actually putting Harry out of his misery in the sewers.
And the character of Anna, do we really know what her motivations are? Yes, she probably loves Lime, but I also get the sense too that she saw Harry Lime as her key to getting into the West. She's not the classic, pure ingenue character. I mean, she has some shading to her character as well. Charles, I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
Well, I think I'd go a little further than probably loves Lime. I think she's portrayed as being head over heels, fatally in love with Lime. And of course, we see her in the days following Lime's supposed death. And we have a character who is completely devastated by what has happened and doesn't really want to go on living. That's how desperate Anna is. when we first see her.
Peter?
Well, I think the question is why does Anna love Harry? Well, love him, of course. She loves him. She's devoted to him. What is she attracted to? Well, she's attracted to his dash, his brio, his sort of. He's an overreacher. There's something powerfully attractive about somebody who is a kind of a modern Tamburlaine, somebody who is such an egotist. And of course, this is one of the things that Reed, in film after film, is interested in exposing. On the one hand, admiring the dash and energy and brilliance of the overreacher, but at the same time pointing to the egotism of these characters. That's something that is part of the Harry Lime character, as well as I was mentioning before, the sort of childish prankishness, the rebelliousness of the child that is also there. When you see Harry Lime for the first time in the film, in that wonderful and iconic moment in the doorway, when the light shines on him, he then begins to smile, the smile of somebody who's been caught in the act of a prank. There is a kind of schoolboyish quality to him, and as I said before, when Anna says, you know, he didn't grow up; it was the world around him that grew up. So that is another element of the Harry Lime persona that she is so drawn to. The other thing is, of course, that in refusing to believe what people say about Harry Lime, is she is asserting the vitality, the life force of the erotic. She is a rebel figure herself. She is somebody who, through her devotion to Harry Lime, is making a statement about her own choices, her own affirmation of life, as opposed to the kinds of life-denying attitudes that his detractors are guilty of.
So that famous entree, one of the most famous in film history, it seems to me it can be read that, because it happens, if I'm correct, as Holly is coming out of the building after having spoken with Anna about investigations and all that, it almost seems to me like Harry Lime at a certain level wants to get caught. He wants at the end to be able to show that he put this all over on the authorities. He put it over on everyone and got away. And it's almost as if there's a slight, or maybe more than a slight, death wish in him, because Holly takes off after him. He escapes. I don't know if it's a phone booth or whatever, is an entree into the sewers then, and now everyone eventually then this is the undoing of the movie. This is the beginning of the end for Harry Lime. So do you think that the Lime character, I mean, what in universe, what was he doing there other than, I mean, was he just trying to spy on her? Was he going to contact Anna, or was he just flirting with disaster, so to speak?
I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, there is a certain amount of self-dramatization in the Harry Lime character. You know, there's the studied look, you know, the dark overcoat, the hat, and the fact that he himself refers in the scene with Holly Martin shortly after this, he talks about Sidney Carton. There's a kind of being in the limelight, and of course, lime is a word, a name that conjures up limelight, being in the limelight, being on show, self-dramatizing. So I think you're right about that. I don't know about death wish, but certainly notoriety is something that appeals to him.
Charles?
Well, I mean, like a cat, you feel that Lime has 9 lives, and you know the way things panned out, he did. Really, after the success of the movie, and Orson Welles later appearing in endless radio adaptations of the Harry Lime character. So I don't associate Lime with the death wish. I think he is like the cat, always landing the right way up. That's how he imagines himself. He will get out of whatever difficult situation he finds himself in. I think that's actually what gives pathos to the suicide sequence, where finally he runs out of options. I found it actually oddly, given the fact that Hare is a rather psychopathic character, there's something rather poignant about the way Lime is cornered and runs out of all options. And Peter pointed out the way there's no music during that final sequence. We hear the wind, the silence, and there's something very, I don't know, quite sort of desperate about the way the sewer sequence exposes Harry.
So let us get on then to the next scene, which is the next major scene, which is of course the famous Ferris wheel scene. And this is going to lead me into a couple of questions that have been asked and spoken about for decades later. But there's the famous scene, the Swiss and the cuckoo clock, and the need for human violence and getting up in the wheel, and then would you really care if one of those little dots down there just died or something? And it's such a great metaphor visually, poetically, the wheel of life, and looking down on the little. And in my mind, Harry Lime so aptly represents what would nowadays be called sort of I guess the neoliberal view of the little people. I mean, looking down on them and they're not worth what we are. I mean, in that way, Harry Lime is a 21st century man. But that famous scene, of course, Wells claimed that he wrote certainly the cuckoo clock part, I believe, and some of the other parts. So let's talk. Let me start with you, Charles, about the scene itself and its sort of importance in the film and its iconic stature, and then the stuff regarding Wells and his participation in that. Go ahead, Charles.
Well, I think it's the only scene in which Lime actually talks. We see him in the doorway. He appears in the film very late on. Yeah. So this is the scene in which we see two old friends getting together after many years, and Polly Martin's coming to terms with the fact that Lime is not the person he thought he knew. So that sense of treachery is something that the scene brings out. And Lime's dismissal of basic human values is something very striking in that scene. The dots. Would you care if one of those dots disappeared? And yet that's counterpointed with a rather chilling glibness. I think we see him draw a heart with an arrow and write the word Anna. Mm-hmm. Everything is a game to him. And we learn too that he betrayed Anna to the Russians. So it's a scene which exposes his evil. This is an evil character, and I think finally the film, I think one reason why it does have a greatness is it does have, it takes a moral stance. It does have a framework of a sense of good and evil, and it really interrogates what it is to be evil, and that's what we see in that sequence. We see what it is to be beyond moral redemption.
Peter?
Well, the film is constantly turning upside down our notions of everything, including good and evil. And I'm reminded in this scene of the way in which, rather amazingly, the porter, in talking to Holly Martins for the first time, when Martins turns up to look for Harry, he's talking about heaven and hell. And when he talks about heaven, he points downwards, and when he points to hell, it's upwards. In a sense, that's what's happening here. We're at the top here. We're in, if you like, a kind of equivalent of heaven. We're at the top of the Ferris wheel, but actually it's a kind of hell, and it is a kind of hell that is ruled over by the racketeer Harry Lime, who has become also sort of identified with Gothic and even satanic characters, if I can put it like that. There's an attraction, of course, to Harry Lime for all the reasons that we've been discussing up to now, all the attributes of dash and energy and brilliance and style and so on. All of those things are very attractive. A bit like the attraction of in Milton's Paradise Lost. There's that element of it. But of course, he is still satanic. And he's up there. So the hell that's down here, as the porter would say down here, is actually up there because it's been taken over by the satanic figure of Harry Lime. And the further cinematic allusion that these considerations seem to me conjure up is the way in which, at one wonderful moment in the film, in long shot, Harry Lime appears at the top of a mountain of rubble in the city, as it slowly appearing, rather like in a gesture that reminds me, anyway, of some of the great moments in Nosferatu. If we talk about the expressionistic traces in the film, that's one of them. He becomes a kind of throwback to Monarch's great character, Nosferatu. He is satanic. He is somebody who's prepared to dismiss ordinary mortals at the provision of penicillin, damning them to a life of pain and ultimately death. This is the new heaven. The new heaven that is the upside-down world that the film draws our attention to in the post-World War II world of Vienna.
You know, it also seems to me that the Ferris wheel could also be seen to symbolize that Vienna had just been lately dominated by the Nazis. Here it gets devastated, and coming up to the top of the world, the Vienna world, is Harry Lime and his underworld. You know, it reminds me of the line in one of the old songs by The Who, you know, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, because there doesn't seem to be a whit's worth of difference between Lime and the Nazis, especially a little bit later when Holly Martins is shown the kids who are suffering because of the crimes of Harry Lime and his switching out of the good medicines for the bad and whatnot. So to me, you know, that's why I say Harry Lime seems to be almost the embodiment of the future, that there are going to be a lot of Harry Limes in the future. They may not, you know, they may not all win, but you know, he's just the vanguard of what's to come.
Well, I guess what Harry Lime and the Nazis share in common is the seductiveness, and this is part of what the film is about, perhaps, the seductiveness of evil. He is a lot of fun. He is an extraordinarily charismatic character. People fall in love with him. Yet, finally, this is a person who sells corrupted penicillin for £70 a tube.
Yeah. So then, as I said, Holly finally is convinced to help capture Harry by seeing these children, especially in the hospitals. He sets up a meeting. Anna is going to be there. Naturally, the minute Lime shows his face, she tips him off, And then we get yet another famous and iconic scene, one that apparently only had a few shots of the real Orson Welles. It was mostly from behind, I guess a stuntman or someone running through the Vienna sewers. And this also, the filming of these scenes also has its own sort of background story in terms of the production values. I don't know if either one of you want to talk about that, because this involves Orson Welles and his coming and goings or whatnot. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to take that first.
Well, just very briefly, people have pointed out, haven't they, that when he arrives to shoot the scene, he's so horrified by the stench and the unappealing conditions of the sewer that he sort of refuses to spend more time there than is absolutely necessary. And as a result, at Shepperton Studios back in England, the sewers were then rebuilt for his convenience. That's right, isn't it, Charles?
Absolutely, yes. He wasn't going to go down into cold, smelly sewers in Vienna. That certainly wasn't on his agenda. So they had to build the sewers for Welles back in Shepperton, and they used doubles in Vienna. Guy Hamilton, the assistant director, doubling often for Welles. I think it's worth mentioning. Yes, there are iconic scenes that are often mentioned, but there are also other sequences that are not so often mentioned, worth singling out, I think, because they bring out what Reed brought to the film. So an unscripted moment is when they're waiting to catch Lyme. So Holly is sitting in the cafe, he has a meeting with Harry Lyme, and the British police military detectives, Calloway and Sergeant Payne, are waiting. And there's a terrific moment of what I would call Reedian suspense, where there they are at nighttime Vienna, and just before Welles turns up, before Harry Lyme turns up, a balloon seller turns up in a completely empty nighttime square in the middle of the night, wanting to sell a balloon to the police military detectives. And I think it's just an absolutely sublime moment. And it's something almost, I mean, it seems to me there's a kind of teasing way that Reed plays with the idea of suspense. It's a playful kind of suspense. It's not a Hitchcockian, tightly wound suspense. It's Reed almost, in an odd way, making fun of the whole idea of suspense. And the balloon seller himself is a Vienna character. He's not an actor of any kind. He's just an extraordinary, incidental face that Reed must have seen when he was on location. And it just brings that quality of realism into the film. And I think that eye he had for these little touches of realism is part of the magic of the film.
And the shadow is very Shrekian, Max Shrekian, going back to your claim about Nosferatu.
The other thing to say about that scene about the balloon seller is the friendship between Calloway and Payne, Sergeant Payne and Major Calloway. In a way, that doubles the relationship of friendship between Harry Lyme and Martins, but it has further nuances. So that when Sergeant Payne is shot by Harry Lyme, it is a moment of pathos and grief. And you detect right the way through the film, whenever we see Payne and Calloway together, there's a terrific bond between them. However, there's also the question of class, which doesn't, of course, affect the relationship between Harry Lyme and Holly Martins. How do we know there's class? Well, of course, they are. One of them is a bona fide officer, Major Calloway, and the other one is a non-commissioned officer, the Sergeant Payne. So that when the two of them meet Martins for the first time in the car of whatever it is, Payne has to sit at a different table. He can't sit with, as it were, the gentlemen who are discussing issues there. Nevertheless, I think the relationship between the two is fascinating from that point of view, and a way of, as it introduces questions of class, but at the same time, it reminds us of and provides a contrast with the friendship between Holly and Harry Lyme. The last thing I want to say about the friendship between Payne and Calloway is the wonderfully understated, typically English sense of humour. The way that is something that connects these two, and is something which appears time and again, not only in this relationship, but also in the way that the Wilfred Hyde White character is allowed to make the odd remark in a, as I say, a kind of ironic way.
It's interesting too. So the obviously we mentioned it earlier. The denouement of this whole film and the final Suez scene is Harry can't escape, but once he's cut off and the police are coming around him, he shoots. I think is it Payne that he shoots, and then it's of course the pulp Western writer who takes the gun, and just like the typical American hero, he gets to shoot the bad guy in the end. And there's those great scenes of the fingers of Harry Lyme reaching out the sewer grate that I guess is bolted down. He can't lift it up, and then they just collapse, and he's dead. And he get in an odd way, Holly gets to live out his fantasy of being the good guy, the cowboy, by killing his friend.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out to be a bit of a nightmare for Holly, doesn't it? Because he doesn't kill the bad guy in the way he might have imagined.
Yeah.
It is a mercy killing. He puts Harry out of his misery, effectively, and in doing so, puts any chances he might have had with Anna completely destroyed. So it's a very strange way of a hero having the last word, it seems to me.
The interesting thing, of course, is that this was one of the scenes that the production code office was very worked up about. That there had to be no suggestion that this was going to be a mercy killing. Various other scenes that the production office under Joseph Breen were agitated about. But it sounds as though, it looks as though this is the reality, that Reed took no notice. And of course, to anybody looking at the film carefully, it clearly is a mercy killing, as Charles says, just as other scenes that Joseph Breen was concerned about were ignored by.
So let's just then wrap up now, because we talked about the ending of Anna walking past Holly Martin. So unless you have a comment on that actual final scene, I just want to talk in some broad strokes about some of the technical aspects, and then we'll get to you guys, your opinions about why the film is great and why anyone who hasn't seen it should see it. So let's talk a little bit. We haven't talked as much about the cinematography, the famous canted angles, the wet cobblestone streets. You mentioned the balloon. We talked about the balloons and that very German expressionistic kind of feel to the film. I don't, you mentioned The Fallen Island. That uses a little bit of it, but I don't think it's nearly as effective as here in The Third Man. And I'd be hard-pressed to think of any film, even, classic films noir from America, that use lighting and shading in such a way. The cinematography really makes Vienna seem like it's on another planet, in a sense. It's an alternate reality in some ways. Would you agree with that, Charles?
Well, I think that's true. And it's a city that has been more than bombed about a bit. We have a vision of the destructiveness and evil of war. You know, this is a city on its knees, and the film captures that quality. So it is a very outlandish world that has been created, but it's an outlandish world that we have created too. This is what civilization has come to in the late 1940s.
And Peter, let me just talk a little bit about the soundscape. We talked about the zither music, and but one of the things that sticks in my mind is I don't think footfalls have ever been used as effectively in any film before or since. And not only just the ones in the obvious ones towards the end in the sewer, but even just in little incidentals, the walking back and forth in various scenes, Holly Martin's pacing here or there, or Payne and the other soldiers walking back and forth. It almost gives a sense, I think, almost of like a heartbeat, that the film itself has it's almost something that represents sort of the beating of the film's center.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are wonderful moments right the way through. There's a moment where Harry is running away at night, and it's Guy Hamilton, the assistant director, is dressed up as Harry and given an overcoat and a clothes hanger to wear on his shoulders, so that he appears as bulky as Orson Welles was as he runs away, and wonderful shadows of his reflection of his shadow as he runs away. But just to go back to visuals,
yeah.
One of the other striking things about the film is the way in which the editing and the montage is so effective. And how often do we get sequences of extreme close-ups of the minor characters, not only of the major characters. Sometimes you get extreme close-ups of Anna, of Holly, but also, excuse me, of the minor characters, of the crowd. So, for example, when Holly Martins turns up at Harry's, and the crowd, thanks to the little boy, begin to suspect him of having killed Harry Lyme. Wonderful montage of extreme close-ups of the mob, so to speak, standing outside. Or alternatively, another example of this, right at the very end, as the police and the soldiers are forming a posse, to use the Western lingo, to hunt Harry down. Again, a montage of extreme close-ups of the members of the posse, so to speak. So Reed is fascinated by human faces, human expressions. It isn't that we're interested in the interiority, the psychological interiority of these characters, because we don't know them. But he is interested in the looks, the expressions, the horror, the growing anxieties, the growing suspicion that begins to spread across the faces of individuals, nameless individuals, who are confronted by this extraordinary series of events.
And I just want to talk about, we mentioned some of the acting, especially with some of the background actors, which is all very good. But of the three main characters in the putative kind of love triangle, Harry, Holly, and Anna, which do you think is the most interesting acting performance, if not the best? I mean, because Wells gets his character gets such a build up, and does he live up to that in his brief, maybe 15, 20 minutes on screen, if that? Alida Valli, which, I think she gives not a great performance, but I think she gives a very good performance that sometimes has been overlooked. And then Cotton. So which of those three performances stand out for you, Peter? And then I'll go to Charles.
Well, I suppose I would want to say that they're equally good, all three of them. There's a sort of mask-like quality to Alida Valli's performance, deliberately so, that she's impenetrable, she's unshakable in her devotion to Harry, and I think that comes through the expression on her face in many, many scenes. Not all the time, of course. She breaks down at one point. We see her a bit more sort of jovial at others in the theatre scene and so on. But on the whole, one's left with that kind of mask-like assertiveness of who she is. Cotton, I love Cotton as cartoons because he brings that sort of crinkly, agonized look as well. He's somebody who is able to express that sense of bafflement. Of course, Cotton is such a versatile actor. We've seen him not only as the good guy in so many films, such as, for example, as the drama critic in Citizen Kane, but we've also seen him as somebody who is capable of darkness, as in Shadow of a Doubt, and to some extent under Capricorn. So he has that ability to shade the innocence and ingenueness of his roles, to shade them with darkness, and I think he does that brilliantly in this film. There's a way in which his pursuit of Harry Lime becomes the I think Freud talks about the way in which the cannibal the cannibal seeks out the person that he loves. So that is something that I think we can talk about from the point of view of the friendship of Holly Wilde. There's something that is drawn to somebody, Harry Lime, at the same time kills the Harry Lime in himself. So there are wonderful nuances, I think, the more that one thinks about Holly Martin's character, the more complex he becomes, and I think Cotton does that brilliantly. And as for Harry Lime, as for Orson Welles, he's so extraordinarily attractive, and he exudes attractiveness through his chuckles, through his smiles, through his glib references to the fact that under the Borgias for 30 years there was pillage, warfare, and so forth, but it led to Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. So it's just a wonderfully glib way of referring to these things, which are at one superficial level so hugely attractive, and of course part of the attraction, that rebellious childishness that draws Anna so much to him.
Charles, what is your take on the three triad characters there?
Well, I think a lot depends upon the dynamic between the three characters and the actors playing the three characters. I think 90% of the impact lies in the casting, actually. Peter mentioned Cotton playing Jed Leland, the drama critic in Citizen Kane. And I think having Cotton and Wells reprising an earlier friendship from that earlier movie, that iconic movie, is part of the powerful impact they make playing two friends again in The Third Man. So I think that's a really important part of the impact that those two actors are able to have. There's a kind of subconscious connection we bring watching The Third Man to previous roles those two actors have played. And I think Wells, there is a kind of Harry Limeness about him. He is perfect casting. There is something larger than life about Wells. There is something outrageous about him. His persona is that of someone who does is someone of excess, someone who breaks through the boundaries, and of course that's very much how we think of Lime too. So I think it's that dynamic of the on-screen, off-screen persona that works so well in The Third Man and brings an extra richness.
So let me just ask you both an individual question, and then we'll wrap up. You had mentioned, I believe, Peter, that Guy Hamilton was the assistant director. That I'm assuming is the same Guy Hamilton who later directed some Bond films in the 60s, correct? Okay, and I know that you Charles, you had mentioned just briefly about the Harry Lime radio show. I'd never heard it. I might have heard one or two little small clips on YouTube. Was the Harry Lime in the radio series, was he a bit more heroic than the Harry Lime as portrayed in the film? You know, it was did they sort of redeem the character or try to in the radio series?
Yeah, I think he does effectively become redeemed. So every week there's a different mystery, and he's a bit of the roguish anti-hero.
Mhm.
I think that's another thing. We're on a journey, aren't we? If we think about post-war cinema, we're on a journey to the anti-hero.
Yeah.
And maybe the Harry Lime character and the redemption of Harry Lime in the subsequent radio series is part of that journey to getting characters like Bond, you know, the slightly off-center hero that you start to get in the 1960s.
And was the radio series set in Vienna? And was it after the film? Was Harry Lime's supposed death at the end of this film, you know, supposedly revealed as just, you know, a feint, or what was the actual, you know, in-universe explanation for it? Or was it set before this film?
Yeah, I can't recall how it starts off with some. Every week would start off with Lime saying he thought I died in Vienna, but no, here I am. I can't recall exactly how it works.
Yeah.
And it's not set in Vienna. It's set. I mean, there's one episode I remember in Tangier.
Mm.
So it's set in you know all over the place.
So let's just wrap this up then. I'll start with you, Charles, and then go to Peter. For anyone who has not seen this film, why should they see it, and why do you think it's a great film? Let me start with Charles.
Well, I'm saying how it has a timeless quality, so it has not dated. Terrific performances. But also in some way topical. So this idea of the charming, roguish villain that Harry Lime plays and the seductiveness of evil, I think it has some quite profound comment to make about that kind of thing. And I think that's terribly relevant to the world we live in today. I think it was Trump who said you could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Meanwhile, here in Britain, we have a liar as our prime minister, and he gets away with it. They're both extremely charismatic populist leaders who have huge support. And perhaps to understand that kind of charm, a character like Lime helps us to do that. And the film, which investigates, explores the seductiveness of evil, helps us to do that.
And Peter, rather, the same question for you. If you were telling someone who's never seen the film, why is this a great film and why should they see it?
Well, I agree with everything that Charles has said. It's a hugely entertaining film, gripping, mysterious, delves into themes that affect all of us about innocence and experience, guilt and innocence. It's about love. It's about the devotion of someone who is unshakable in her devotion to the man that she loves. Brilliantly made. It's got a terrific pace. It doesn't at all slacken. It keeps you hooked right until the very end of the film. But by the way, just as a postscript to what we were talking about vis-a-vis the spin-off radio programs, there was also a TV spin-off, starred in a most unlikely role for Harry Lime, starring Michael Rennie. And I remember seeing that series back in the late 50s. Don't ask me to say what they were like, except that Michael Rennie was hardly a Harry Lime equivalent.
Yeah, here in the States, he's mostly known for the UFO movie. What was it called? With the robot Gort. The day the world
Yes,
ended or something? Oh,
the Earth stood still.
yeah, day the earth
That's
stood
right.
still, right, yes.
And of course, he was also Saint Peter, I think, in the robe.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you for spending an hour and a half or so speaking about this great film. I will link to your university website, Peter, and I will link to charlesdrazen.com for Charles. Anyone who wants to find out more about you guys or what you've written about this film or anything else can contact you there. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dan, for having us.